Good evening, I'm Dana Foster and you're watching Sun Valley News. It's Monday, September 27th, and we'll have your weather and roads in just a bit. I'm your host, Dana Foster. Thanks so much for watching today. Let's take a look into what is happening in our local news. Current residential school survivors and their families and our communities are invited to attend a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation event on September 30th. This event is going to run locally from 10 a.m. Until 3 p.m. and then 3:30 to 7 p.m. there will be a family dance to follow at 5 p.m. at the Cache Creek Community Hall. There will be vendors that are going to be set up outside and inside, and there will be poster making, crafts, and door prizes to be won if you attend. Guests are reminded to wear their orange shirt, and if you have you would like to have more information, you can contact the Health and Social Department at 250-457-2624. This day has been created to give everyone an opportunity to recognize and acknowledge the Bonaparte residential school survivors, their families, and then also our communities. In other news, Interior Health is holding a COVID-19 vaccine shot. This will be at clinic every Wednesday from all the way until November 10th. This is at the Ashcroft Hospital and Healthcare Center. The clinic will be open from 9 to 2:45, and this is for anybody who has not yet received a vaccine, who are age 12 years old or older. If you'd like more information, you can call 1-833-838-2323. And the school district 74 School Trail is seeking the public's input on two proposed changes to the trustee electoral areas. This is proposed that the community of 16 Mile will be changed to Rural Area C, Clinton, and to Rural Area D, Cache Creek, and that Venables Highland Valley and the community of Ashcroft Indian Band will be then changed to Rural Area E, which is Linton, to the Ashcroft electoral area. If you would like to put in your public opinion, public input can be submitted until the 30th, so we only have a few days. You can just email the District 74 at district74@sd74.bc.ca to complete that survey. You can also go to www.sd74.bc.ca and you can complete that survey there. So let's go take a look into our weather. And that doesn't want to show up today. Always Mondays has all the technical issues. It always happens. Let's see. The weather is brought to you, and weather and traffic is brought to you by Andre's Tire World in Kamloops. For the best service at the best price and the largest selection in town, go to Andre's Tire World, located at 341 Victoria Street West. Taking a look into our weather in Clinton, or Linton. Tonight, mainly cloudy, a 60% chance of showers, risk of a thunderstorm early this evening, and a low of 10. For tomorrow, mainly cloudy, a 60% chance of showers, and a high of 15. Weather for tonight, partly cloudy, a 40% chance of showers early this evening, and then a risk of a thunder shower, a high of 17. In Lillooet, it will be mainly cloudy, a 40% chance of showers, a risk of a thunderstorm early this evening in Lillooet, and a low of 9. On Tuesday, mainly cloudy with a 30% chance of showers and a high of 17. And then over in Clinton tonight, partly cloudy, a 30% chance of showers early this evening, and then a risk of a thunderstorm, a low of +5. For Tuesday, a mix of sun and cloud, and then a 40% chance of showers in the afternoon with a risk of a thunderstorm, a high of 13. Let's take a look into our roads. Let's see. Oh, look at that. It's working. All right, taking a look into our roads. On Highway 97, there will be road maintenance from Scotty Creek Road to Linton Cemetery Road. That's going to be 18 kilometers north of Cache Creek, 2 kilometers south of Clinton. That will be until Friday, October 1st from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then watch out for shadow vehicles on Highway 1 in both directions. There is construction between Highway 8 and Cornwall Road. That's 9 kilometers south of Cache Creek to Spence's Bridge. And there is single lane alternating traffic, and you can expect 5-minute delays, and be sure to watch out for signage and personnel. That is your road report for today. If you have something to report, you can call our news line at 236-597-NEWS. If you also have want more road conditions, just go to www.drivebc.ca. Over 7,000 people have died of a toxic drug poisoning since the province declared the toxic drug crisis a public health emergency. Over 1,000 lives were lost to suspected illicit drug toxicity in BC between January and June of 2021. This is according to data released from the BC Coroners Service. Among those most impacted are First Nation people, who account for nearly 15% of all toxic drug deaths last year, and Indigenous people only represent 3.3% of BC's total population. According to First Nations Health Authority data, 254 First Nation individuals died from toxic drug overdose in 2020, and nearly 120% increase compared to 2019. Since COVID-19, Indigenous communities are now seeing the highest rates since 2015. Today, we speak with Cheyenne Johnson, who is the Executive Director of BC Center on Substance, on how drug addiction in First Nation communities is related to historical racism, colonialism, and stigma. Let's take a look. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cheyenne. I love having the opportunity to talk to you about this really interesting subject. So can you tell us how addiction in Indigenous communities is related to racism?
Sure. So for those of us who are First Nations living in BC, overdoses or drug poisonings is really only one representation of the deep intersection of current and historical racism, colonialism, and stigma, which are all, again, really intricately linked to health disparities that Indigenous people experience. In BC, First Nations people are so greatly impacted. We see huge discrepancies between First Nations and non-First Nations people with overdose deaths, that First Nations die more than 5 times than non-First Nations people. And although Indigenous people only make up 3.3% of the population, they represent 15% of all overdoses. And First Nations women are also overrepresented in overdose data. In non-Indigenous communities, we see men dying at higher rates, but First Nations women are more than 2 times more likely to experience an overdose and more than 10 times more likely to die from that overdose. And, these are unacceptable numbers. Overdoses is destroying many Indigenous communities. And unfortunately, the resources and supports have been minimal. And they're particularly minimal when we think about the provinces in Canada's response to COVID. We all rallied, vaccines were created, there was a rollout approach, billions of dollars. We don't see that same sense of urgency to toxic drug deaths, and particularly in First Nations communities who are very hard hit.
It's easier to go and get a substance than it is to get help today. You're on a waiting list to get into rehab. You're on a waiting list to just see a therapist. You can go down to the corner and get what you need. It's heartbreaking. How does colonialism affect substance abuse among Indigenous people?
Well, again, to me, structural anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism are so intertwined in the history and legacy of racism and colonialism in Canada. That includes residential schools, Indian hospitals, the 60 Scoop, to name a few. And this pervasive racism is really upheld and amplified by these colonial structures and results in the pervasive way that many non-Indigenous people see First Nations people and communities. Mm-hmm. And that's as less than. It looks like people not respecting traditional knowledge in medicines and oral history, that it's inferior to written history and scientific journals, that Indigenous people need the colonizer to save them, to provide them with education and health care, or to meet their spiritual needs. And this has really created a legacy of racist policies and highly stigmatized environments for Indigenous people, which limits their access to culturally safe care and ultimately results in a lack of trust by Indigenous people in the healthcare system.
Some may be watching and think, oh, well, this is just an excuse for people to continue their drug addiction or drug abuse, to say that racism or colonialism is just an excuse. What would you say to those?
Well, I think first and foremost, as a society, addiction and substance use has been ignored for so long. It was always thought to be a moral failing, which again is intricately tied to racism and colonialism, the stereotype of a drunk Indian. But in the last several decades, there's been vast improvements in Western medicine approaches that are still so inaccessible to many First Nations communities. And additionally, First Nations communities need to be supported in their autonomy and self-determination to how to best approach addiction and overdose in their community. And for some First Nations, this has included combining Western medicine with traditional ways of knowing and healing, which has resulted in, vast improvements for individual wellness journeys, but also for community healing.
How can we combat drug addiction and drug dealing in Indigenous communities?
Well, at the root of all overdose harms and substance use challenges in Canada is really bad drug policy. We know unequivocally that the quote unquote war on drugs has been an utter failure. Since the 80s, drugs have been more accessible, they've been purer, and they've been cheaper prices than we've seen ever. And we know that also with the coinciding of COVID and overdose, drugs have become more toxic, adulterated or contaminated with fentanyl and other medications like benzodiazepine, which have made overdoses worse and causing more deaths. So really at the root of this cause is addressing drug policy in Canada and looking at approaches to decriminalizing personal possession or strategies to better regulate substances so that people can be assured if they are using substances, they know the quantity and quality that they're receiving and would be much less likely to die. And that, again, needs to be paired with supporting Indigenous communities with the self-determination to build Indigenous-specific substance use health and social services for their community.
So why is it there's the approach of safe drug use or abstinence? There's sort of those two approaches. It's either abstinence or safe drug use. Why is safe drug use being discussed today?
Again, I think it relates to how bad drug policy is in Canada and the history of prohibition, which again has its roots in racism and colonization. And because of prohibition, the drugs, as I mentioned, have gotten more toxic and more adulterated, meaning that individuals who have used substances for a long time can die of an overdose from, the same amount that they took in the morning because the quality and the quantity is really not the same. And so that has really forced the health system and also I think Indigenous communities to look at a full broad spectrum of wellness and health approaches that are needed to address substance use. You can't support somebody in abstinence or recovery if they aren't alive. And so many communities, and also with the support of the First Nations Health Authority, who have recently developed a harm reduction policy, which looks to, again, kind of indigenize those approaches to bring together principles of harm reduction with traditional knowledge and medicine to create a bit of a path for how Indigenous communities can better receive and scale up harm reduction services in their own communities.
If a community wants to start advocating either against drug dealing or drug use or safe drug use, what can they do? What steps can they take?
So again, I think one piece that we've really been supporting, and again, this is through a partnership that we have with the First Nations Health Authority, is an initiative around having difficult conversations around substance use. For so long, as you mentioned, many Indigenous people and communities have really thought of their approach to substance use being a red road approach, an approach really focused around abstinence. And I think we really need to come together to identify a path towards healing. So these webinars, they support communities in a talking circle format to share that where individuals share their experience of substance use and stigma and racism, in that we can better support communities to start or continue the conversation. And they really come from a strengths-based approach to focus on Indigenous strengths and resiliency to promote culture as a pathway for wellness. And so we worked with many First Nations communities across BC, and they've all, it's been a successful approach at getting the community to start to identify, again, Indigenous-led and community-led solutions around overdose, but also around drug policy issues like drug dealing and the harms in their communities.
And how can people who are watching better educate themselves on colonialism, racism, and how it's related to addiction?
Well, I mean, as you know, Dana, I think Indigenous people know there's been so much written on this, but such slow action and implementation. I'd really encourage people, if they haven't read it, to read Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's 2020 In Plain Sight report, which documents the severity of racism in the healthcare system, combined with the 94 calls to action for truth and reconciliation, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada. The blueprint is there. But we also know that while Indigenous people who experience the problem of racism in the healthcare system need to be involved in the solutions, we know that the responsibility and the burdens of this work lie with non-Indigenous individuals and communities and organizations, and especially governments.
Thank you, Cheyenne, for joining us today, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, you've been watching Sun Valley News. I'm your host, Dana Foster. If you have a news story, you can email me at info@sunvalleynews.ca. This beautiful set backdrop is brought to you by Bubbles Blossom Design. If you want more information, go to www.bubblesblossomdesign.com. And if you would like to become a sponsor, you can email me at info@sunvalleynews.ca. That's it for our show today. Be sure to join me on Wednesday at 5 o'clock. And yes, that's right, we have now moved our live stream to YouTube. Still working out some of the glitches so you can watch on our website as well. Just trying to figure out how to best bring you the news today. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you on Wednesday.